It was 1987 when Thomas Ward returned home. After 50 long years of disappearance, no one knew where he had gone. The town had all but forgotten about him. Yet, here he was, appearing at the gates of the sleepy town of Havens Hollow, untouched by time. His hair was as dark as the day he left, his face unmarked by age. His eyes, however, told a different story. There was something in them that was off. His gaze had no recognition or sign of warmth or connection. Local authorities were skeptical, but they couldn't deny the impossibility of what was standing before them. They documented his return, but soon, things started to feel wrong. He never aged a day and never seemed to sleep or eat. Whenever someone approached him, he would slip away, vanishing into the woods like some shadow in the night. It was the strange, unnerving return that piqued the interest of Alex Carter, an investigative journalist. He had come to Havens Hollow in search of a story, but now he found himself drawn into something much darker than he could have imagined. Alex had read about Thomas Ward's disappearance long before he arrived in Havens Hollow. Ward had been a brilliant scientist, a prodigy in the field of nuclear research. He had vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1937, while working at a top-secret government facility. The project, codenamed Game of Gods, had been shrouded in secrecy, and the investigation into his disappearance had been quickly swept under the rug. As Alex dug deeper into the history of the project, he uncovered something disturbing. Ward's research had been focused on time manipulation, on the possibility of controlling time itself. There were rumors that the experiment had gone horribly wrong, that Ward and others involved had been lost in a series of temporal rifts. And now, after 50 years, Ward had returned. Alex's curiosity took him to the old facility, the abandoned nuclear reactor that had once been the site of Ward's research. The place was decaying, overgrown with vines and rust, but it still hummed with a strange energy. It felt alive, as though the reactor itself had a consciousness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old machinery and the cold sting of metal. The walls seemed to pulse as if they were breathing. And then Alex heard it, a low hum that reverberated through the concrete, echoing in his chest. It was coming from deeper within the reactor. His heart raced as he made his way down the corridors, following the sound. It felt like the walls were closing in around him, each step dragging him deeper into a place he was never meant to enter. As Alex explored further, he stumbled upon old files, dossiers on Ward, on the Game of Gods, on the men and women who had disappeared. The documents were filled with names he had never heard of, but there was one name that stood out: Samantha Green. She had been Ward's partner, a fellow scientist, and she had vanished along with him. The deeper Alex dug, the more unsettling the findings became. The Game of Gods was not just a scientific experiment. It was an attempt to manipulate the very fabric of reality. Ward had been obsessed with the idea of bending time, of controlling the flow of events, of rewriting the past and future. But something had gone wrong. There were accounts of people, dozens of people, who had been lost during the experiment, their bodies never found, their fates never explained. Alex's unease grew as he realized that the reactor had not been abandoned by accident. Something had been left behind. Something was still alive in this place. Suddenly, Alex was jolted by a sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the shadows. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. A figure emerged from the darkness, Thomas Ward. But he wasn't the same man Alex had seen in the town. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He walked with an unnatural, deliberate gait, as though he was moving through a dream. Alex Carter. Ward spoke in a voice that wasn't quite his own, a voice that was hollow and distant. "I've been waiting for you." Ward's gaze fixed on Alex, his eyes piercing into him like a dark hole. There was a sense of dread in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Alex's chest. Ward's presence seemed to warp the very air around him, like the laws of reality were bending. "What is this?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "What happened here? What happened to you?" Ward tilted his head, as though the question confused him. "What happened to me? I became part of the experiment, the game of gods. And now, so have you." The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? What game?" Ward's lips curled into a cold, unfeeling smile. "The experiment was never about time, Alex. It was about control. It was about creating a loop, one that would trap us all forever. The reactor, it was never just a machine. It's a doorway, a gateway, a way to trap time, to trap us." Alex's mind raced. He had thought the experiment was about time travel, about manipulating the past and future. But it was something much darker. The reactor wasn't just a machine, it was a prison. You're still trapped here?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ward nodded slowly. "All of us are. The experiment, the game, it didn't end. It never will." As Ward spoke, Alex began to feel the oppressive weight of the reactor pressing down on him. The walls seemed to shift, warping and distorting as if the very fabric of reality was breaking. His head spun, his vision blurred, and he felt as though he were slipping out of time itself. The reactor's hum grew louder, more intense. Alex staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, trying to steady himself, but the walls were no longer solid. They pulsed, they moved, as though the very structure of the facility had become alive. "You feel it, don't you?" Ward's voice echoed in the madness around them. "The game is starting, and now you're part of it. Just like me, just like all the others who came before." Alex wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The reactor's energy gripped him, pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of time and space. "You were chosen, Alex," Ward continued, his voice a low, haunting whisper. "Chosen to take part in the game of gods. And now you will play, whether you want to or not." Alex's mind snapped as the reactor flared to life. His body was torn from the ground, pulled toward the center of the room, where the core glowed with an intense, unnatural light. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the walls of the reactor warping into grotesque shapes. He saw flashes, visions of the past, the future, alternate realities. He saw himself trapped in a loop over and over again. Every time he tried to escape, he was drawn back in. Every time he thought he had broken free, the game pulled him back. And then he saw something else. A figure standing in the center of the reactor. It was him. No, it wasn't. It was his reflection, twisted and wrong, its eyes hollow and dark. "You're a part of this now," the figure spoke, its voice a twisted echo of his own. "You can never leave. The game will never let you go." Alex's body was consumed by the light of the reactor. His mind fractured, the visions growing more intense, more unbearable. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the chaos, swallowed by the reactor's hum. The world around him twisted and fractured, collapsing into 1,000 versions of reality. He saw every possible outcome, every possible future. He was everywhere and yet nowhere. And then, everything stopped. He was back in the town of Haven's Hollow, standing at the gates. Thomas Ward stood before him, unchanged, as though nothing had ever happened. "The game continues," Ward said, his voice cold and distant. "It always will." Alex's heart sank as he realized the truth. There was no escape. Alex's body was no longer his own. His mind had shattered, splintered into 1,000 pieces. The game had claimed him just as it had claimed all the others before him. And now he would play, forever. The cycle would never end. The game of gods continued. Alex's mind was beginning to dissolve, each flicker of consciousness slipping away like sand through his fingers. But something inside him resisted. It was faint, like the last gasp of air before drowning. But it was there. He was no longer sure what was real anymore. The town, the reactor, even Thomas Ward, they all seemed to blur into one endless nightmare. He would close his eyes and see himself standing in the gates of Haven's Hollow again. But it would never feel the same. Reality bent, cracked, and reformed. He tried to scream out to Ward, to demand answers, but his voice was a mere whisper lost in the infinite expanse of this broken world. His feet moved on their own accord, carried forward by an invisible force. Each step he took felt heavy, the ground beneath him sinking with every movement. It was as though the very earth had become unstable, as though time itself was shifting beneath his feet. "Thomas?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. But Ward was no longer the man he remembered. His body was a grotesque reflection of a man trapped in a broken timeline. His skin had turned pale and translucent, and his eyes, once cold but alive, now seemed to be nothing but hollow black voids. Ward's smile twisted, and his voice resonated through Alex's mind like a plague. "You thought you could escape, didn't you? You thought you could break free of this loop? There is no escaping the game of gods, Alex. You are already dead. And yet you're alive, trapped, just like me." The world around them shifted once again. The reactor that had once been a cold, lifeless machine now pulsed with an eerie energy, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The walls, cracked and decayed, seemed to stretch toward Alex, and the shadows moved with malevolent intent, creeping along the walls like tendrils of darkness. Alex tried to move, to break free from the suffocating grip of whatever force was controlling this place. But he could not. "You're just a piece in the game," Ward's voice echoed again, wrapping around Alex like a coil tightening around his chest. "You've always been a piece, Alex. A pawn. You were always meant to be here, just like me. We were all chosen for this. We were sacrificed." Alex stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. He could feel it now, the weight of the truth pressing in on him. This place, it was not just the reactor. It was the game, a never-ending cycle of suffering, and he was its newest player. The memories of those who had vanished before him. Samantha Green, Thomas Ward, the others, flashed before his eyes, their faces contorted in terror, their cries muffled by time. All of them were part of the same twisted experiment. They had been chosen, manipulated, and trapped. And now he was next. He turned his eyes toward the reactor. It wasn't just a machine, it was alive. The energy within it was not from any scientific source he understood. It pulsed like a heart, like a living entity, feeding on time, feeding on souls. Its radiance enveloped him, pulling him in like gravity. "No, I won't be like them," Alex muttered under his breath. "I will break free." But as soon as the words left his lips, the world around him began to fracture again. Reality cracked open like a shattered mirror. Time spiraled, and Alex's body was flung through the rift, tumbling through endless voids of twisted timelines, each one more horrific than the last. When Alex regained his senses, he was standing in the middle of a familiar street. The town, Haven's Hollow. But it was different. It was darker, the air thick with an unnatural silence. The houses were in disrepair, their windows shattered, the streets empty and abandoned. There were no people, no life, just the eerie hum of the reactor, still resonating in the background. He turned, looking for Ward, but found nothing. It was as if the town had died, or perhaps it had never been alive to begin with. Everything felt like an illusion, a fading memory of a place that no longer existed. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. He was here again. The cycle had started over. "No, no," Alex shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. His hands trembled, the weight of the truth crushing him. He had never left. He was stuck in this loop, part of the game forever. The reactor's pulse thrummed louder now, shaking the earth beneath him. Felt close, so close. And in the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ward again, or at least it looked like him. But his eyes were dark pits, like portals into something beyond time. His form flickered, as though he were made of light and shadow, a distorted version of the man Alex had once known. "Welcome back, Alex." Ward's voice was cold, disembodied. "You'll never leave. None of us will. We are trapped here, bound to the game of gods. Time is no longer linear. You cannot escape what you've become, what you are." Alex stumbled backward, his chest tightening with panic.
No.
"No, this isn't real. Can't be. I won't let it be." Ward's hollow eyes bored into him. "You can fight, but you will lose. You've already lost. This is not just a game, Alex. This is your reality now. Your prison. You were chosen. And once you're in, there is no escaping the game of gods." Alex gasped, his mind reeling. The reactor, the endless loop, it wasn't just time that had been manipulated. It was his existence that had been altered. "Am I dead?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. Ward nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth curling into a twisted smile. "In a sense, time has consumed you. You have crossed the threshold. This is your fate now. All those before you, they are part of this cycle too, forever and ever. You are no different." The world around them twisted again, reality breaking apart, and the darkness enveloped Alex. His screams echoed through the void, but no sound came out. Alex awoke again, standing in the same spot, the same street, the same desolation. The reactor hummed in the distance. Ward was gone. For a moment, there was silence, a fragile stillness. But Alex knew better now. He had been here before. He had seen this, and no matter how hard he fought, no matter how desperately he tried to escape, the cycle would never end. There was no beginning, no end. Time was no longer his to control. And so, Alex stood in the empty street, waiting for the inevitable return, waiting for the game to begin once more, because no matter how many times he tried, he would always be pulled back into the endless loop, and he would never escape. Alex's sense of time had shattered beyond repair. The days, the hours, they no longer made sense. In one moment, he would be standing in the empty streets of Haven's Hollow, watching the dilapidated town crumble into the ether. In the next, he would be swallowed by darkness, only to reappear again at the very same spot. The sequence played out in an unbroken cycle, with the faintest hint of a memory reminding him of something, someone. Something he needed to do, something he needed to understand. Every time the loop restarted, he felt a flicker of resistance. There were moments when the walls of his mind would crack open, allowing fragments of clarity to slip through, but those moments were fleeting, vanishing faster than they arrived. It was like grasping for smoke. He would always be drawn back to the reactor. As much as he resisted, he couldn't escape its pull. No matter how much he ran, no matter how much he screamed, it was always there. Its low hum permeating the air, vibrating through his bones. It was as though the very fabric of his being was tethered to the reactor's core, a force that refused to let go. The worst part was the quiet moments, the ones between the resets, when Alex would be alone in the desolate town.
No guard, no reactor.
Just the sound of his breathing and the faint rustling of wind through the broken windows of abandoned homes. It was in these moments that Alex's mind would begin to crack even further. He would question whether he was truly alive or if he had slipped into the realm of the dead. But the thought of death itself was twisted and disjointed, impossible to grasp. Was this his punishment for something he had done in the past? A consequence of the experiment he had uncovered? Or was it something far darker than he could understand? He had long since stopped trying to make sense of it. One reset, however, was different. When Alex appeared on the cracked streets of Haven's Hollow again, the town looked new. The buildings were whole, the windows unbroken. The air was warmer, the sky clearer. It felt like a momentary reprieve, a fleeting glimpse of what might have been. But it didn't last long. From the distance, he saw something moving, someone walking toward him. A woman. At first, Alex thought it might be a figment of his mind, some manifestation of the endless loop. But as she drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was Samantha Green. She was alive. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, her eyes filled with knowing, the kind of knowing that only someone who had experienced the horrors of this place could possess. She looked older, worn by time, but she was undeniably alive. The same woman he had seen in the research files. The same woman who had disappeared along with Ward. "Samantha?" Alex whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. She stopped before him, her expression unreadable. "You're still here," she said softly, as if it were the most obvious statement in the world. "I thought you might be. After all, we've all been here before, haven't we?" Alex shook his head, trying to process her words. "What is this? Why are you here? Where are we? What's happening to us?" She stepped closer, her face pale but calm. "This is the game of gods. This place, it's not a part of reality. It's a space between worlds, between times. A place where the experiment has no end." "You mean we're dead?" Alex asked, dread filling his chest. Samantha's eyes flickered with sadness.
No.
"We're not dead, but we're not alive either. Not anymore. We're stuck. We are the result of the experiment that Ward started. The loop, the time rifts, the endless resets. They were all designed to trap us here, in this purgatory between time and death." Alex's mind raced. "But why? Why are we here? What happened to Ward?" Samantha's gaze darkened. "Ward's the one who did this to us. He became obsessed with controlling time, with manipulating the very fabric of reality. But the reactor, it doesn't just manipulate time. It warps it, traps it. We're its prisoners. I don't understand. Why us? Why me?" Alex asked, his voice breaking. Samantha took a deep breath. "Because you were meant to be here. You were chosen, Alex. You, just like the rest of us, were part of the game. And the worst part is, there's no winning. There's no escape." Alex felt the ground beneath him tremble, a faint hum filling the air, the reactor's presence looming in the distance as if it were waiting for him to fall back into its grasp. The realization hit Alex like a tidal wave. All of his resistance, all of his attempts to escape had been in vain. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a punishment, a test of will and endurance, one that could never be passed. "You're saying we're part of some cosmic game?" Alex whispered, more to himself than to Samantha. She nodded, her eyes distant. "It's not just time, Alex. It's reality itself. Every loop, every reset is a different version of this world, of us. But in every one, we're trapped. We're like pieces in a chess game, endlessly moving, never making progress. It's all an illusion. All of it." Alex's hands trembled. He reached up, clutching his head. "This can't be real. None of this can be real. This isn't my life." Samantha stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It's all you have now. This is your life, your punishment. The reactor feeds on souls, Alex. And the game goes on, with each of us taking turns. One life, one soul after another until the game ends. If it ever ends." The words lingered in the air like a suffocating cloud, and for a moment, Alex thought he might suffocate under their weight. This wasn't an experiment. This wasn't about control. It was something far more insidious. Something meant to break them, mind, body, and soul. And the worst part? He was already broken. As the hum of the reactor grew louder, vibrating through Alex's very bones, Samantha's eyes grew weary, as if she had given up on hope long ago. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "The game, it's endless, and you can't stop it, but you can choose." You can choose to fight, or you can choose to accept it. Alex's heart beat in his ears. His mind reeled. What do you mean? What are you saying? Samantha's gaze softened. You can choose to try again, to face the game, to escape the cycle. But the longer you resist, the more you'll lose of yourself. Eventually, you'll forget. You'll forget who you are. You'll become part of the game, and the game will consume you. Alex's thoughts spun, his entire being pulling him in opposite directions. One side of him screamed for him to fight, to break free, but the other, quieter voice, the one that had slowly begun to settle in, told him that it was already too late. He was already lost. I don't know if I can fight anymore, he whispered, his voice shaking. Samantha looked at him with a sorrowful expression. It's not about fighting, Alex. It's about understanding. Understanding that you're already part of the game, and you always will be. Alex's knees buckled, his body giving in to the weight of the truth. He closed his eyes, and the world around him began to crumble once again. The reactor's pulse, the endless hum, swallowed him whole. The game was far from over, and Alex had no idea if it ever would be. Alex's vision blurred as the world around him twisted once more. Reality itself seemed to splinter, stretching in every direction, bending and warping as if it were being rewritten by an unseen hand. He felt the reactor's pulse surge through him, his entire being vibrating with the energy, each beat a reminder of his helplessness. The hum was not just a sound, it was an oppressive force, pushing and pulling at the very core of his existence. He didn't know how long it had been since he last saw Samantha. Her words echoed in his mind, haunting him, as if they had become part of his very essence. You're part of the game, Alex, and you always will be. Part of the game. The phrase haunted him like an omen. It was as if he had been made to forget who he once was. Perhaps he was a man, once full of purpose and life, but now, he was nothing more than a fragment, a broken shard of his former self, endlessly moving through time and space, never quite whole. He stumbled through the ruined streets of Haven's Hollow, his legs shaky, his breath shallow. The town looked different this time. The houses were more intact, the air heavier with decay. He felt the ground beneath him shift in subtle ways, as if it, too, were part of the game, shifting with every beat of the reactor's pulse. Everything felt wrong, wrong. It was the only thought that still made sense to him. Nothing about this place was real anymore. Was anything real? Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the silence, a mechanical clicking sound that made his spine tingle. He froze. The hum of the reactor faded for a moment, and in the eerie stillness, he heard footsteps. The footsteps were uneven, heavy, like someone or something was dragging their feet. His heart leapt into his throat. He turned, his breath catching in his chest, and saw a figure emerging from the shadow of a collapsing building. It was Ward. The man's form was barely human, a warped version of the person Alex had once thought he knew. His face was hollow, with sunken eyes that gleamed black like pits, and his skin was stretched taut over a skeletal frame. He moved slowly, almost mechanically, dragging his legs as if bound by invisible chains. "Alex?" Ward rasped, his voice a hollow echo, as though it were not his own. "You still don't understand. You never will." Alex's throat constricted, and for a moment, the world seemed to go still. Time slowed as the figure of Ward advanced, his ragged breath the only sound in the thickening air. What happened to you?" Alex croaked. His voice barely seemed his own, like the last remnants of his identity were slipping through his fingers, lost to the abyss of the game. Ward's lips curled into a twisted, ghostly smile. "Haven's Hollow is a prison, Alex. A prison for souls, and you're just like the others, just another piece in the game. But you still think there's an escape, don't you?" Alex's hands clenched into fists at his sides. his nails digging into the skin of his palms. "I don't believe you," he spat, the words bitter in his mouth. "I'm not a piece." Ward let out a hollow laugh, the sound like a broken wind chime, haunting and mournful. "The game of gods doesn't care about what you believe, Alex. It's not about you or any of us. You're just a player in a game that has no end, no winner." Alex took a shaky step back, his pulse racing. The world felt even more unstable now, as if the ground beneath him might shatter at any moment. "Where's Samantha? What's happened to her?" Alex demanded, his voice rising with panic. "What's going to happen to me?" Ward's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's gone, Alex, and so are you. You were never meant to escape. None of us were." The weight of those words sank into Alex's chest like a lead weight. He had known, on some level, that escaping was a fantasy. But to hear it from Ward, to have it confirmed in such a twisted, dead voice, it shattered what little hope remained. "Why?" Alex's voice broke as he spoke, and the raw emotion that surged through him felt almost alien. Was this who he had become? Was he really this broken? Ward's eyes flickered with something, almost like pity. "It was always a game, Alex. A game designed by those who think themselves above us. The reactor is not just a machine, it's a prison. And we were all chosen." The words made Alex's stomach turn. His vision swam as if his mind was refusing to accept the horrible truth. "I don't want this," he whispered hoarsely, clutching his head in his hands. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for any of this." "You don't get to choose, Alex," Ward said, his voice strangely gentle now, almost sympathetic. "None of us did. You can scream, you can fight, you can even beg for answers. But in the end, it won't matter. There's no escape. There's only the game." Alex's knees buckled beneath him, the weight of his existence, the endless cycle, the impossibility of ever breaking free. It all crashed down on him. His breath hitched as a sense of despair like nothing he had ever felt before overwhelmed him. His entire life, his memories, they felt like echoes in a vast and empty void. Suddenly, the reactor's pulse grew louder, its hum reverberating through the air, shaking the ground beneath them. A blinding flash of light surged from the reactor's core, and for a moment, Alex thought his heart might stop. His vision whited out, the world collapsing into a wash of blinding energy. When he opened his eyes, the town was gone. In its place was the reactor, looming before him like a twisted deity. It hummed with malevolent energy, its massive form twisting the very air around it. And then, standing before it was Samantha again. She stood motionless, her face gaunt and resigned, her eyes hollow. "You're here again." As the reactor's pulse filled the air, reverberating through every inch of Alex's fractured mind, a haunting silence descended upon him. His body felt numb, his senses dulled. And yet, even in the suffocating weight of inevitability, there remained a flicker, faint but undeniable. It was a thought, small but persistent, nagging at the edges of his consciousness. The truth was clear now. He had become one with the game. But as he stood there, locked in the clutches of time and space itself, Alex understood that the game was far from finished. And neither was he. There was one choice left. It wasn't a choice to escape, for escape had never been possible. It wasn't even a choice to win, because victory had been stolen from him long ago. No, it was a choice to remember. Alex's breath hitched as he realized that his mind, the very core of his being, was the final piece that the game had always needed. It was his awareness, his understanding, that could shatter the cycle, break the endless loop that had trapped them all. With a sudden clarity, Alex realized what he must do. He had to break the illusion. He had to make the world see him as more than just a pawn in a cruel cosmic game. And perhaps, in doing so, he could awaken others. Will you fight, or will you accept this fate? The question echoed in the silence, a whispered challenge from deep within his consciousness. There was no answer from the shadows, no reassuring voice to guide him. Only the hum of the reactor, louder now, vibrating through his soul. Alex's heart raced, his hands trembling as he stood at the precipice of his own mind. He could hear the ticking of time, the fleeting moments stretching out in every direction. He could remain here, passive, broken, lost to the game forever. Or he could do the one thing the game had never anticipated. Fight not against time or the reactor, but against the game itself. The final decision was his, and perhaps, just perhaps, he could drag the truth into the light. If he could awaken one person, one soul in the cycle, maybe they could all be saved. Maybe this curse could be broken. But that battle could only be fought if you, the reader, choose to remember. Remember that reality is fragile, that time is not a straight line, that there are forces far beyond our understanding that work in the shadows. The truth is out there, but will you see it? Will you wake up? The game of gods is not just a story. It's a challenge to break the cycle. And now it's your turn to choose. Will you fight, or will you become part of the game?